All right, our next conversation partner is Justin Giboney, and Justin is he made the longest trip to be here tonight. So he actually drove up here from Atlanta to do this, and then he's going to turn around and drive back. So thank you. Now, immediately you're going to think that I didn't have anybody in Nashville to ask, right, to have this part of the conversation. But the conversation that we're going to have is the hardest one, I think, for people in our culture to have today. So let me introduce you, and then we're going to jump into that. Justin is an attorney and a political strategist in Atlanta, Georgia. He's the co-founder and president of the AND campaign, A-N-D. The AND campaign, which is a coalition of urban Christians who are determined to address the sociopolitical arena with the compassion and conviction of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Justin he has managed successful campaigns for elected officials in the state and referendums related to the city's transportation and water infrastructure. And so certainly transportation infrastructure is something we have needs of here, which you may have experienced today. We have a lot of people moving to Nashville, so if you wanted to come north, you'd be most welcome.
Okay, this is good to know.
But welcome this evening.
Thanks for having me, Carmen. I'm glad to be here.
We're going to talk about how Christians can engage in and lead the conversation on difficult topics. So let's start with what's the AND campaign as a sort of entry point to this conversation.
Yeah, so the AND campaign, which launched about a year and a half ago, is really a coalition of urban Christians primarily, not exclusively, but that's where I'm at. That's where the group of my friends who founded it, that's where we're at. And really what we wanted to do is we discovered, and this is part of my testimony, that a lot of our friends wanted to be involved in cultural and civic conversations. The issue that they had was that once they entered into those conversations or into that space, that they were forced to go all the way to the left or all the way to the right. And the way I read the Bible and the way that I had learned it was that that's not really tenable for Christians. That a lot of times when you go all the way to the left, you're going to surrender some of your convictions, and if you go all the way to the right, you're gonna kind of surrender or sacrifice some of the compassion that we're supposed to have as Christians. And so I always wondered why those two things needed to be treated as mutually exclusive. The way I see it is the gospel, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, did your book come from Ephesians 4:15? Speak the truth?
And absolutely.
Yeah, so the AND campaign is based on Ephesians 4:15, which is Ephesians 4 is Paul telling the church of Ephesus about unity within the body of Christ. And then he goes on to say that basically mature Christians, regardless of what's going on, what false teaching or whatever's going on, we're able to speak the truth in love. And so the way we saw that was compassion and conviction, that we couldn't come into the public square and choose one, that we actually should be practicing both of those at the same time. And so really the AND campaign is a refusal to have the public square force us to choose one or the other. It's basically saying we're going to be compassionate and convictional because that's what Jesus Christ has called us to do.
So you know that I resonate with that. And you also know that a lot of the folks with whom I have been in conversation in the past would be on the right end of some of those perspectives, and have not necessarily been very good at even recognizing the humanity, let alone the dignity of folks on the extreme other end of the conversation. Mm-hmm. So as you inhabit that I don't even want to call it middle ground, as you inhabit the common ground, as you inhabit the space that says we're not giving up the truth or the grace of the gospel. Mm. This is where we're going to stand. What have you been pleased by? What has surprised you in a positive way about those who have been drawn into that space from the right and from the left?
I think I've been surprised that people from both sides are open to the framework. Right. It's one of those things where when we explain it, people are like saying, I've been feeling that way. I just had never articulated it in that way. And so I've been encouraged really by so many believers saying, no, I get it. And I think that's right. I think we do need to practice it that way. So I've been encouraged, and that's come from both sides. And still sometimes we get people who are like, well, we really like the conversation about, the social concern, but we really don't want the biblical values. And every now we get the other, which we love the social justice or social concern, but we really don't, want the other side. So we just have to learn. There's a time of training to get to that point. But we've been very encouraged by the response, especially by a lot of young Christians, but others as well.
So Joseph mentioned it earlier, but Governor Bill Haslam said earlier this month, and actually former President George W. Bush said almost precisely the same thing today, that we as people of God, the church, maybe as an institution, if we're going to name it something, we really have to be on the forefront of a restoration of civil conversation. But I think it goes beyond that. One of the things the former president said today was, we actually have to remember that we're looking at another person who bears the image of God. We're a long way from that reality in our culture. Mm-hmm. And so let's talk about, let's start the conversation on the subject of race and racial reconciliation. Mm-hmm. You and I both recognize that the church has to lead in this conversation. We are the ones who know that at creation and at the cross and in the kingdom, we're on level ground. Mm-hmm. It's every tribe and tongue. And so just give us a little perspective and an introduction to that topic in terms of where you guys are at.
Yeah, so I agree. I think Christians have to lead the way. I don't think change is going to come any other way. But at the same time, we have to deal with some of our internal issues before we can heal the world, right? There's very clearly, and I'm not going to surprise anybody by saying this, a racial and sociopolitical divide within the church. And it's a divide that when I read the gospel and I read through scripture, that I don't see any justification for, any way that we should feel comfortable with that divide. And we have to find a way to come together and get past that divide, I think, before we can really speak to the world in any credible way. And I think the number one obstacle to getting there is humility. I think it's going to take a lot of humility, and it's going to be painful. I believe it's a very painful journey to get to there, but that's what discipleship is about. So the reason that I always point to humility is because humility opens up the door for compassion, right? So as believers, we have to understand that whoever we see, we could see someone walking down the street, and there could be someone who's homeless by their own doing, right? But we still know as Christians that the only thing keeping us from being in that position is grace. It's not anything that we've done. So if we have the humility to realize that, then you have the ability to feel compassion for that person. So I think we have to start there. And what that means in practice is if Justin comes to Carmen and says, well, when this happens, it makes me feel a certain way, or I think society treats me differently in this or that way, she doesn't automatically say, well, this is what you could have done better, or what about Chicago, or what about this? She hears me out and really tries to internalize what I'm saying before immediately coming back at me with something else. I mean, me and my wife go through this sometimes. If she says, well, Justin, you didn't throw out the trash, and I said, well, you didn't do this or that, well, she knows I didn't listen to her, right? That message didn't get through. And I think in race relations, that happens all the time. If I explain something and try to say why it's painful to me or why the history is painful, sometimes it's even historical facts. So if I come up here and I give a historical fact, people automatically get defensive and say, well, what about this or what about that? That's not humility. That's not listening. And sometimes that can be expressed better, but I think we all need to take the time to say, how can I make it better? You can't necessarily be worried about how Justin can make it better because you can't control what I'm doing, but you can control how you respond to certain things. And so I think one of the biggest things from my perspective is making sure we don't automatically get defensive, automatically try to protect ourselves. Because when I read through the gospel, it's not about protecting myself from something. It's not all about defending myself. I think we have to open up and kind of have that humility. The next step, so I think racial reconciliation, which we hear a lot, is a process. And I think we a lot of times we try to skip from not really communicating, not really talking to say, let's reconcile. But it's a longer process than that. So I think one thing is first step.
One of the things you taught me is that to even have it pass through my mind that somebody should just get over something, That's not where we're at. You have to
Right.
go through it together.
Right.
There's a through it together part of this. And that's, I think, the non-defensive thing is really important, and it's the starting point, but it's this process of going through together
That's
to
right.
reconciliation.
So the way we put it from the AND campaign is you can call it a 4-step process. The first is to be informed and to be made aware. So we have to open up and at least be willing to hear the past, hear the facts, hear how people have been hurt, and understand systemic issues within our society. We have to open up to have those conversations. So that's one, the awareness, the information. Number 2 is what you're getting at, is the relationship. It is very hard to hate a certain group of people when you actually know them, and when you've actually experienced, when you know what their experience has been. When you can summarily dismiss someone, you probably don't have a great relationship with them, or you're not being charitable towards who they are. So if we can continue to summarily dismiss each other, we don't have the relationship that we need to have. After the relationship and through the relationship, I think you get to a point of restoration. So opportunities to say, I think Joseph gave a great example that some of his friends who are creating these schools may be creating opportunities for the less fortunate, some urban children that might not have had an opportunity to go to those private or charter schools. Those type of things are restorative measures that help you get to a reconciliation or conciliation, and so we can start to heal. But it's a process that we can't just jump into, because there is a lot of, or a lack of, trust. And we all there's not one side that goes through it, but we all have to be willing and open to go through that process. But we have to be open to it by not so much worrying about what the other side could do better, but making sure we're doing as much as we can ourselves.
It wasn't all that many years ago that you and I could not have sat in this place, in this county, and had this conversation. And you couldn't have safely driven by yourself back out of here at night. We're not talking about ancient history. We're talking about, a shared and lived history. And I am certain that white Christians have come to an awareness and an awakening, even just in the last several months. And the acknowledgement of the very real pain and the very current pain, that this is not ancient history. This isn't even a generation old, right? It's not. And so I one of the things that I want to say is, thank you for your patience and your grace, as we're going to make mistakes in what we say and how we say it, as we're learning. And as we're growing, and as we're finding ways to, to recognize, even the concept of systemic, something that is systemic. I have to tell you that there's just a lot of folks that do not yet understand what that means, right? They don't understand that it's about, who's controlled the wealth, and it's about who's controlled the levers of power, and everything sort of trickles down from there. People don't understand that. And so when they think, we use the word systemic, well, no, we have plenty of laws that say everybody's equal. But you and I both know that does not equality make. And so just, if you're willing, give us a little insight into what it's like to be a young African-American man in America today.
Sure. So when we talk about systemic issues, which I wrote for Christianity Today, maybe in June, about systemic issues and what that means, I think we have sometimes we turn these issues into things that are just so untouchable. They're just like mysterious, and it's not that hard. It's actually fairly simple. If you go through years of, segregated education, and the education system isn't necessarily equal, even when you have laws to make it equal, it doesn't automatically change, right? Because there are certain things within the system that say the same. And the same thing for housing. If you have people in substandard housing to go on and on and on, then those things matter. I'll give you an example because I know we were talking about telling stories. So you all may have heard of Fannie Lou Hamer, who was a civil rights legend, and she has an interesting story that I think can give us some insight into these conversations, and then I'll get to the more personal side. But I think this is important for the systemic understanding. So Fannie Lou Hamer grew up in Ruralville, Mississippi, and she came from a family that were sharecroppers. And so back at that time, a lot of the sharecroppers were going through basically the same type of conditions as slaves were. I mean, they were just out of slavery. Now, Fannie Lou Hamer is the same age as my grandmother, maybe a few years older, or one of her older brothers and sisters, but this isn't that long ago. So she was a sharecropper, and back then, because there was no education, a lot of sharecroppers, they couldn't keep records because they were illiterate. So sometimes they would work for a year and only get about 20% of what they were owed. 20%. You work for a whole year, you get 20%, and there's no judge, no jury that's gonna give you justice for that. You just have to suck it up because you want to live, and you don't want to get kicked off the land. So her family went through that, but somehow, in going through that, they were able to save their money. And after years and years, they saved their money. They bought, I think, a wagon, 2 cows, and 3 mules, right? So they're happy because if you're just coming out of slavery, you haven't owned anything. You didn't even own yourself. And so for you to come together and save, even after being cheated, to save the money to buy something like that is a big deal. So she explains in her biography how important this was to her family and how proud they were of this accomplishment. So they're excited. They go off to go get some food or go meet some family members, something like that. They leave the land, and a white man comes onto the land, and he pours some poison into where the animals eat, right? So he pours poison into it. By the time the family gets back, they see that all the stomachs of the animals are swollen because that's what this poison did. The stomachs would swell, but that's how you could tell it was too late. So all the animals died that they had saved all this money to get. So this did a few things, right? There's the financial part of it where they cannot have generational wealth at that point. They never again owned anything. They never owned their own land or anything like that. So they don't have generational wealth that they can put through to their children. But there's something even deeper, and I think even more evil that this did. Because the man who did this was sending them a message. He was sending them a message that no matter how hard you try, no matter how much you save, no matter how much you came together and planned, you will never get out of this situation. That's the message that was being sent to them. And if you've been sent this message over and over throughout generations, you don't just get over that. Because her father had to go tell his children somehow to still have hope and whatever, but they didn't see anything change. And so it affects your work habits. It affects how you see work, right? There's some people who see work one way. There are others who say, it doesn't matter how much I work, it's going to be taken away from me. Now, those things have to change. But this is what I mean by systemic psychological issues that do not just fade away with generations. If we can sit here and talk about, American exceptionalism and how this is passed down through generations, then we can talk about how other psychological issues and systemic issues are passed down through generations. And so that stuff matters. And so for me, it's tough to have these conversations sometimes because you do see people hurt and you see people in these situations, and not everyone is sensitive to it. Not everybody's compassionate to it. But on the other hand, that's kind of what discipleship is, right? It's talking to those who may not be willing to listen, but you have to do it anyway. I mean, I think it was Isaiah, where God sent him out, and Isaiah's like, well, how long am I going to be out here? How long do I have to do it? And God's like, do it until. He's like, they're not going to listen. They're not going to do anything you tell them to do, and that's how you'll know that you're actually doing what you're supposed to do. And so in a way, it is, it's discipleship, but in another way, we have to come to a point where we do start to have those conversations and be open to move forward. But it doesn't happen if we aren't open to listen. So, it can be tough. I have friends with many stories of getting pulled over for no reason. I mean, it's happened to me too. And you try to take it in stride, but as Christians, we need to at least be open to listening and hearing people out.
Well, thank you for being willing to speak into it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I got involved in a Facebook conversation a few days ago. This is a well-educated person who, in my view, should not be posting such antagonistically racist things on her Facebook feed, and so I felt like I should engage. So it was, well, I'm posting on her page. It's not on my page. You'd have to be seriously trolling me to know what I'm posting on other people's Facebook feeds. Anyway, so she posted, and she was doing it snidely in response to something else. So she posted, "Can someone define systemic racism without looking it up?" And I thought, I can. So I gave it a shot. I want you to grade my answer, and let's talk about it a little bit. The systems of any or every society are created over time by those who control the means of production and the levers of power. Here, that means the government. In the United States, since our formation, both the means of production and the levers of power have been predominantly controlled by people who are racially white. Systemic racism, then, is the reality that non-white people have over time had less control of and therefore benefited less from both the means of production, which produces personal wealth, and the levers of power, which tend to produce influence and influence every other system. How did I do? And what did I miss?
I think that's really good. I mean,
she accused me of looking it up.
That's the gist of it. I mean, I don't think it has to be a perfect answer, but it just tells you that it's not a level playing field all the time, right? And we have made, and so I also get upset when people say we haven't made any strides towards it. I think we have made strides towards it, I think it's disrespectful for those who have worked to get there to say that we haven't. But there's still a ways to go, and so we just listen to each other as we plow on down towards that goal.
It feels to me like the ways to go that's left is not something the government's going to do, right? I think that, in terms of a level playing field, we at least have, maybe not perfect laws, but we at least have laws related to equality. And so it feels to me like we really do need sort of an influx into the conversation of just regular people. But what is that? I mean, imagine with me what that looks like. How do we engage in a culture-wide conversation that maybe is distinctively Christian and led by the church? Because certainly we're having very hostile public conversations about race today. NFL players, I mean, we're having them in negative ways. Imagine for a moment how we could have them differently.
Well, I think I'm participating in that. It starts here. It starts with these conversations and expanding these conversations. And I agree with you, to a certain extent. I do think in criminal justice there's some laws that we could change that a little bit. And I've seen some governors really working on doing that. So I'm happy to see those changes and people taking it seriously. But it starts. The AND campaign's about to go on a tour at the beginning of the next year called the Frontline Discipleship Tour. And the point of the Frontline Discipleship Tour is to say that Christians need to be on the front lines of these issues. Let's make an example to the rest of the world of how this looks. And part of making sure that we do it the right way is being able to step back a little bit, and what we say is transcend partisanship a little bit. So that doesn't mean you can't participate in partisan, in a party all you want, but you should be able to step away from it and also critique your party, critique the other party, and say, on some issues, I just have to step away from this so I can find common ground. Another part of us really being able to speak prophetically in that regard is making sure that and there's a fly,
there's one fly
over my head, yeah.
I know.
Making sure that we don't see this as a zero-sum game, and I think Joseph spoke on that a little bit as well. It is not, and this is where we get in trouble politically, it can never just be about winning. It can't be primarily about winning. And the AND campaign talks about this over and over. Sure, we want to win. Sure, we're going to be strategic. We want to have influence because we want to save lives. We want to help the poor, and that's a big part of it. But the number one thing we should be doing is making sure we're putting an authentic Christian witness into the public square. A lot of the mistakes Christians have made in supporting people we shouldn't support or getting into situations we shouldn't be in is because we wanted to win. Because once again, we were trying to protect ourselves or we were trying to protect our interests, which that's not always bad. it just can't be primary. Primarily, we have to make sure people are seeing Jesus Christ through us. And it's funny because it really is those first lessons that we learn that we need to employ right now. I was watching, I think it's called Bible Man with my son. And I was seeing things that I was like, I don't know if I still learn that. I'm expecting him to learn it.
Bible Man.
He's all about Bible Man. But it's love your enemy. I mean, do we even try to do that when it comes to some of these conversations? If we would just employ some of the very simple things that we learned when we were 3 years old, my son's a 3-year-old, we would be in a much better position, but we haven't even done that. So it's painful and it's a long road, but it's not necessarily that we need to learn new things. I think sometimes we need to relearn what we've left behind.
Amen. All right, let's give Justin a hand, and we're going to bring Joseph back up.